The first beam cracked at exactly 8:04 p.m. Judge Harrison Pemberton was mid-sentence, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips, when the sound, like a rifle shot in an empty church, cut through the dining room. He looked up. The crystal chandelier above the massive oak table swayed. What was... The second beam exploded. The eastern edge of the floor dropped 6 inches. Chairs scraped against tilting wood. Wine bottles tumbled. Colonel Richard Whitmore grabbed for the table as the world beneath him shifted. Then the third beam went, and the fourth, and the fifth. The massive oak table, 400 pounds of carved mahogany, lurched sideways like a ship in a storm. Crystal shattered. Silver platters launched into the air. Thomas Brackett's chair tipped backward as the floor beneath it simply ceased to exist. 8 beams, 3 seconds, 12 feet of free fall into darkness. 11 of South Carolina's wealthiest plantation owners dropped through the floor of the Whitmore Mansion's grand dining room and into the parlor below. 2,900 pounds of flesh, furniture, and shattered timber hit the ground floor with a sound like the earth splitting open. Then silence, then screaming. By dawn, they were all dead. And the enslaved carpenter who'd engineered their fall was calmly pulling bodies from the rubble, his face appropriately shocked, his hands steady, his secret perfect. His name was Samuel, and 6 months earlier, they'd forced him to watch while they sold his children. March 14th, 1856, 6 months before the fall. Samuel's wrists were bleeding. He'd pulled against the rope so hard that the hemp had cut through skin, but the 2 overseers behind him didn't care. Their job was simple. Make sure Samuel watched every second of what was about to happen. "Do I hear 800? The auctioneer called out, gesturing toward Mary, Samuel's wife of 16 years. "Prime breeding stock, gentlemen. Strong hips, proven fertile, already delivered 3 healthy children." Samuel's vision blurred with tears, but he couldn't look away. The colonel's orders had been explicit. Watch. Remember. Learn your place. A man from Georgia raised his hand. 820. 850. Someone else countered. Mary's eyes found Samuel's across the yard. She wasn't crying anymore. She'd cried herself out hours ago. Now she just looked at him with an expression that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not accusation, not anger. Just a quiet question. How did we get here? He knew how. 3 days ago, Samuel had done something unforgivable. He'd demanded, that Colonel Whitmore not sell his family. He'd used words like please and beg and mercy, words that slaves weren't supposed to direct at their masters. The colonel's response had been immediate. "You're a hammer, Samuel. You're a saw. You're a tool that I use when I need it. You don't make demands. You don't negotiate. You serve." Then he'd scheduled this auction, a teaching moment. Mary sold for $920. Samuel watched her drag toward a wagon, still reaching back toward him, her mouth forming his name over and over. Then came the children. His daughter Rachel was 7. The auctioneer made her stand on the block and turn in a circle while men examined her like livestock. Samuel heard someone say, "Good bones. She'll be worth twice this in 5 years." She sold for $300. His sons, Marcus, age 12, and Jacob, age 9, went next. Different buyers, different states. Samuel would never see any of them again, and he knew it. They knew it. Everyone knew it. By the time the auction ended, Samuel was kneeling in the dirt, no longer pulling against the ropes. The fight had drained out of him. He felt hollow, empty, broken exactly as the colonel had intended. Colonel Whitmore walked over and looked down at him. Do you understand now, Samuel? Do you understand what you are? Samuel looked up at him. The colonel's face was calm, satisfied. This wasn't cruelty to him, it was education, proper management of property. Yes, sir, Samuel whispered. Good. Now get cleaned up. I need you starting work tomorrow. We're hosting a dinner party in September, the Plantation Masters Summit. 11 of the most important men in South Carolina will be here. The mansion needs to be perfect. They untied him and left him in the dirt. Samuel lay there as the sun set, staring at the sky. Around him, the plantation continued its normal rhythm. Enslaved people returning from the fields, the smell of cooking fires, children laughing in the distance, other people's children, children who hadn't been sold yet. He thought about the mansion. He'd built it 14 years ago, beam by beam, nail by nail. It was considered the finest house in 3 counties. Masters came from Virginia to see his craftsmanship. He knew that house better than any living person. He knew where it was strong, and he knew where it could be made weak. Samuel stood up slowly. His wrists were still bleeding. His face was still wet with tears. But in his chest, something had shifted. The hollowness was filling with something else, something cold and patient and absolutely certain. He walked to his workshop behind the slave quarters. His tools hung on the wall in perfect rows, saws arranged by size, planes oiled and sharp, chisels that could split hair. His 2-fingered left hand, he'd lost the other fingers to a sawing accident 20 years ago, moved across the workbench, touching familiar handles, familiar steel. The colonel wanted the mansion perfect for September. Samuel would make it perfect, perfectly engineered for catastrophic failure. April 1856, 5 months before the fall. Samuel, you've been working on this parlor ceiling for 3 weeks, the overseer said, frowning up at where Samuel stood on his ladder. The colonel's getting impatient. When will you be done? Samuel lowered his paintbrush and looked down. His face showed nothing. 25 years of slavery had taught him to keep every thought locked away behind a mask of patient servitude. Quality work takes time, sir, he said quietly. These beams are 14 years old. The wood has settled. I'm finding small cracks, minor water damage. If I don't address these issues now, we could have serious structural problems later. The overseer grunted. The colonel wants everything perfect for his dinner party. I understand, sir. That's exactly why I'm being thorough. The overseer walked away, satisfied. He didn't notice the hand auger tucked into Samuel's tool belt. Didn't see the fine sawdust in Samuel's pockets. Didn't understand that the small holes Samuel was drilling into the massive heart pine beams were invisible from below. Perfect circles bored at precise angles, following the grain, creating cavities that weakened the internal structure while leaving the exterior flawless. Samuel waited until he was alone, then positioned his ladder directly beneath the eastern beam. This beam supported the dining room above, specifically the section where the colonel would sit at the head of the table. He placed the auger bit against the wood, 3/4-inch diameter, 4 inches deep. He turned the handle slowly, feeling the bit sink into dense pine. The sound was barely audible, a soft grinding that blended with the general noise of the plantation. After 30 seconds, he withdrew the auger and pocketed the sawdust. 1 hole, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. He checked his mental map. He'd calculated that this beam needed 17 holes, arranged in a specific pattern to reduce its load-bearing capacity by 70%, while maintaining the appearance of structural integrity. 1 down, 16 to go, 7 beams after this. By the end of April, he would compromise the entire support system beneath the dining room. Then he would wait. patient, invisible, perfect. In the evenings, Samuel sat in his workshop and did mathematics. He calculated weights. The oak table weighed 400 pounds. Each chair, 30 pounds. 11 men averaging 200 pounds each. The serving platters, decanters, roasted meats that would be served at the colonel's dinner. Total weight, approximately 2,900 pounds. The beams, in their current state, could support 20,000 pounds easily. But with 70% of their internal structure removed, their capacity would drop to roughly 6,000 pounds. Still too much. He needed them closer to failure. That's when the wedge design came to him. May 1856. 4 months before the fall. Ruth found Samuel working late one evening. The old cook approached his workshop cautiously, looking over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. "Samuel," she whispered, "can I ask you something?" He looked up from the piece of oak he was carving. "Yes, ma'am." "That parlor ceiling? You've been working on it for 6 weeks now. Every day, up on that ladder doing something. What exactly are you doing?" Samuel's hand stilled. Ruth was smart, observant. She'd survived 40 years of slavery by reading people, by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. He could lie to her, should lie to her. But Ruth's son had been sold south 3 years ago. Her daughter had died in childbirth after being forced to breed with a man twice her age. She understood loss. She understood rage. "Preventing a disaster," Samuel said carefully. "What kind of disaster?" "The kind where old beams, weakened over time, can't support the weight they're meant to carry." Ruth studied his face. Her eyes moved to the piece of oak in his hands, a wedge, 4 inches long, carved to a precise taper. "That's a strange shape," she said. "What's it for?" "For creating pressure points," Samuel replied. "Sometimes you need to apply force in exactly the right place to make something shift." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The colonel's dinner party, the one in September. That's when those important men are coming. 11 of them." "Yes, ma'am." "They're going to be eating in that dining room, right above that parlor ceiling you've been working on." "Yes, ma'am." Another silence. When Ruth spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "Their families coming too?" "No, ma'am. I made sure to check. The colonel planned it as a men-only gathering. Private business discussions. The wives and children will be at a garden party in Charleston that day." Ruth's eyes met his. Understanding passed between them like an electric current. "How long until you're finished?" she asked. 4 more months of preparation, then 1 night of execution." "You need help?" "No, ma'am. This has to be me. Only me. If it fails, I'm the only one who hangs." Ruth reached out and squeezed his hand, the one with 2 missing fingers. "Then you better not fail." She left without another word. Samuel returned to carving wedges. He would need 48 total, each one precisely shaped to fit into slots he would cut into the beam surfaces. The wedges would create stress concentration points, forcing the compromised wood to fail along predetermined fracture lines. Remove the wedges at the right moment, and the beams would collapse within minutes. He carved late into the night, his 2-fingered hand moving with practiced precision. Each wedge had to be perfect. This wasn't carpentry anymore. It was engineering, mathematics, physics applied with deadly intent. June 1856, 3 months before the fall. The close call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Samuel was drilling into the 4th beam when he heard footsteps on the stairs. He'd been alone in the parlor for hours, but now someone was coming. Multiple people. He pulled the auger out, pocketed it, and grabbed his paintbrush, just as Colonel Whitmore entered with 2 guests, Judge Pemberton and Thomas Brackett. "Here's the parlor," the colonel was saying. "Samuel's been doing magnificent restoration work. The old place looks better than the day we built it." Samuel climbed down from his ladder, paintbrush in hand, face carefully neutral. The 3 men walked around the room, examining the walls, the furniture, the ceiling. Judge Pemberton stopped directly beneath the beam Samuel had been drilling just seconds earlier. He looked up. Samuel's heart stopped. The judge was staring right at the section where Samuel had drilled 17 holes over the past 3 weeks. They were invisible in the dim light. But if the judge looked closely, if he noticed the subtle pattern— "Fine work, Samuel," the judge said, tapping his walking stick against the beam. "Solid as the day it was built." The walking stick hit exactly where Samuel had drilled. The wood sounded perfect. The exterior shell was still intact, hiding the honeycomb of cavities within. "Thank you, sir," Samuel said quietly. Thomas Brackett walked over and examined the ladder, the paint supplies. "How much longer until you're finished?" "Another month, sir. I'm being thorough. Want to make sure every detail is perfect for the September gathering." "Good man," the colonel said. "That's why I value you, Samuel. You take pride in your work." "Yes, sir. I take great pride in everything I build." The 3 men left, their voices fading down the hallway. Samuel stood frozen for a full minute, his heart pounding. That had been too close. If they'd arrived 30 seconds earlier, they would have caught him with the auger in his hands, sawdust on the beam, no way to explain what he was doing. He climbed back up the ladder on shaking legs and examined the beam. The judge's walking stick had struck between 2 drill holes, missing them by inches. Samuel took a deep breath and pulled out his auger. 17 down, 146 to go. July 1856, 2 months before the fall. The mansion buzzed with preparations. The colonel had invited not just the 11 plantation owners, but their families as well for a weekend of socializing. But Samuel had learned something crucial. The men would dine separately from the women on the final evening. The wives and daughters would attend an elaborate garden party at the Charleston estate of Governor Adams, while the 11 men held their private summit in the Whitmore dining room. Perfect isolation. No witnesses. No innocent victims. Samuel finished drilling the last of his 163 holes on July 28th. 8 beams, each one riddled with precisely placed cavities that had reduced their load-bearing capacity to roughly 4,000 pounds total. Still not enough. He needed them at the edge of catastrophic failure. The wedges would provide that final push. He worked at night, when the house was dark and the White family slept. His workshop was 200 feet from the main house, far enough that no one would hear him moving. He'd practiced walking the route in darkness until he could do it blind, across the yard, through the garden, to the side entrance he deliberately left unlocked during his repairs. First night. He cut 6 slots into the first beam, each one 3 inches deep, positioned directly over the weakest points created by his drilling. The work was delicate. One slip, one sound too loud, and he'd wake the household. He used a small chisel and a wooden mallet wrapped in cloth. Each cut took 5 minutes of careful work. By the end of the first week, he'd cut all 48 slots, 6 per beam, positioned with mathematical precision. By the end of the second week, he'd inserted all 48 wedges. The beams groaned when he tapped the last wedge home, a low, ominous sound like a ship's hull under stress. Samuel froze, listening. Nothing. The house remained silent. He climbed down from his ladder and examined his work. The wedges were flush with the beam surfaces, invisible in the darkness. But they were doing their job, forcing the wood fibers apart, creating microfractures that spread through the compromised timber like invisible lightning. The beams were now loaded springs, held in place by small pieces of oak that Samuel could remove in seconds. Everything was ready. August 1856. 1 month before the fall. Samuel couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. The floor falling, the beams breaking, 11 men dropping into darkness. He saw his children's faces. Rachel at 7 years old, standing on the auction block. Marcus trying to be brave at 12. Jacob crying at 9. He saw Mary reaching back toward him as they dragged her to the wagon. He saw the colonel's satisfied face. Do you understand what you are? The rage had burned cold inside him for 5 months. Now it was crystallizing into something harder. Not rage anymore. Purpose. Ruth found him in his workshop one evening. You sleeping? She asked. Not much. You having doubts? Samuel looked at her. No doubts, just calculations. Making sure I haven't missed anything. What if something goes wrong? What if the beams don't fall? What if they fall wrong and you get caught? Then I hang, Samuel said simply. But those 11 men will still know that someone tried. That a slave, a tool, a piece of property, engineered their deaths. Even if I fail, they'll know they're not safe. That we're not all passive. That some of us fight back. Ruth nodded slowly. When? September 12th, evening. After the household slaves serve dinner and are dismissed. When it's just the 11 men, alone in that dining room. And after? Assuming it works? I keep working. Keep pulling bodies from the rubble. Keep my face shocked and my mouth shut. Let them think it was termites. Bad luck. An act of God. And if they suspect? They won't. I'm invisible. I've been invisible my whole life. That's my advantage. Ruth squeezed his shoulder. Your children would be proud. Samuel's throat tightened. My children will never know. No one can ever know. This secret dies with me. Maybe that's how it should be, Ruth said. The best revenge is the kind no one sees coming. September 12th, 1856. The fall. The day arrived hot and humid. The 11 plantation owners had been at the Whitmore estate since Friday, and now it was Sunday evening, the final dinner before everyone departed. At 4 p.m., the wives and daughters climbed into carriages bound for Charleston and the governor's garden party. The colonel had planned it perfectly. The men would have complete privacy for their business discussions. Samuel watched from his workshop window as the carriages rolled away. No innocent people in the house now. Just the 11 men who'd built fortunes on suffering. At 6 p.m., the enslaved houseworkers began serving dinner in the grand dining room. Roasted duck, imported wines, delicacies that cost more than most slaves earned in a lifetime. Samuel stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the workers carry platters upstairs. He could hear the men laughing, their voices loud with wine and confidence. At 7:45 p.m., the last enslaved worker was dismissed. The 11 men were alone now, sitting around the massive oak table, discussing cotton prices and the proper management of their human property. Samuel slipped out of his workshop and crossed the dark yard. The mansion's windows glowed warm in the evening heat. He could hear their voices through the open windows of the dining room. He entered through the side door and moved to the parlor. No lights. No sound except his own breathing. His hands found the first wedge in the darkness. He'd practiced this moment 100 times, running through the sequence in his mind until it was automatic. Pull. The wedge slid out silently, dropping into his palm, He pocketed it and moved to the next. Above him, the beam groaned. Quietly at first, then louder. In the dining room, someone said, "Did you hear something?" "Old house settling," the colonel replied. "These mansions always make noise." Samuel pulled the second wedge. Third. Fourth. The groaning grew louder. Timber under stress, internal fractures spreading, wood fibers compressing and splitting. Fifth wedge. Sixth. Seventh. He moved faster now. He could hear chairs scraping upstairs, men standing, concern in their voices. "Richard, something's wrong with your floor." Eighth beam. Final 6 wedges. Samuel's hands moved like lightning. Pull, 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 pull. All 48 wedges in his pockets now, weighing him down like stones. The beams screamed. Samuel ran for the door. Behind him, the world ended. The 3-second fall, Judge Harrison Pemberton was reaching for his wine glass when the floor dropped 6 inches beneath his chair. Time seemed to slow. He saw the crystal chandelier above him jerk downward, saw wine bottles sliding across the tilting table, saw Thomas Brackett's face frozen in an expression of confusion. Then the second beam went with a crack like a cannon shot. The massive oak table lurched sideways. 400 pounds of carved mahogany lifting at one end like a seesaw. Plates and glasses launched into the air in a glittering cascade. Colonel Whitmore grabbed for the table edge as his chair tipped backward. His mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. The ceiling was groaning. The floor was tilting. The chandelier was falling. And then, in that final second before the third beam exploded, he saw it. He saw 6 months of Samuel working on the parlor ceiling. Saw him on the ladder every day, drilling, measuring, always drilling. Saw the careful patience in Samuel's eyes when he'd said, "Quality work takes time." The colonel understood. This wasn't an accident. His carpenter, his tool, his property, had killed him. The realization took less than a second. Then the third beam went, and the fourth, and the fifth. The floor didn't crack. It didn't splinter. It simply ceased to exist. 8 beams failing in cascade, each failure adding stress to the others. The entire support structure disintegrating in a mathematical sequence that Samuel had calculated 6 months ago while his children were being sold. 11 men. 2,900 pounds of flesh and furniture. 12 feet of free fall. Judge Pemberton had time to scream. So did Thomas Brackett. The colonel opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Just a breathless gasp as gravity took him. They fell through the dining room floor and into the parlor below. The oak table hit first, shattering against the parlor floor with a sound like thunder. Then the chandelier, crystal exploding like fireworks. Then the chairs, the serving platters, the wine decanters. Then the men. Some hit the table. Some hit the floor. Some hit the fallen beams that had collapsed beneath them. The impact shattered bones, stopped hearts, crushed skulls against wood and stone. The colonel landed on his back, the wind driven from his lungs. He tried to breathe and couldn't. Tried to move and couldn't. Something heavy was on his chest, the table, pinning him down. Around him, he could hear groaning, screaming, the wet sound of men trying to breathe through broken ribs. Then silence. The colonel's vision was fading. Blood filled his mouth. He stared up through the ragged hole where his dining room floor had been, seeing stars through his bedroom window above. His last thought was of Samuel. Samuel, who'd built this house with his own hands. Samuel, who'd known every beam, every joint, every structural weakness. Samuel, who'd taken 6 months to engineer 3 seconds of perfect revenge. The colonel's eyes closed. When they found him at dawn, he was still pinned beneath the table, his face frozen in an expression that might have been understanding. The aftermath. Samuel was in his workshop when the enslaved people from the quarters came running. He joined them, his face appropriately shocked, his hands trembling just enough to seem real. The mansion's central section had collapsed inward. The dining room floor now rested in the parlor, everything a chaos of broken timber and shattered furniture. And 11 bodies. "Get help!" someone was screaming. "Ride for the doctor! Ride for the sheriff!" Samuel moved toward the wreckage. Other enslaved people were already pulling at debris, searching for survivors. There were none. Samuel worked through the night, helping recover the bodies. Each one confirmed what he already knew. They were all dead. Quick deaths, most of them. The impact had been catastrophic. The sheriff arrived at dawn with deputies and structural experts. They examined the collapsed beams, noted the holes riddling the wood. "Powder post beetles," one expert said definitively. "Classic infestation pattern. They eat the wood from inside. You can't see the damage until the structure fails." "How long has this been going on?" the sheriff asked. The expert examined a beam closely. "Years, probably. These beetles worked slowly. The beams looked fine from the outside, but internally they were hollow." The sheriff turned to Samuel. "You maintain this house?" "Yes, sir," Samuel replied quietly. "I inspected the beams regularly. They appeared sound from the exterior. I didn't know they were compromised internally." "Not your fault," the sheriff said. "These things happen. Old houses, hidden damage. It's a tragedy, but it's not negligence." They carried the 11 bodies out and laid them in the yard. Samuel stood with the other enslaved people, watching. No one suspected him. Why would they? He was just a slave, just a carpenter, just a tool. 2 years later, Samuel stood at the Philadelphia docks, breathing free air for the first time in his life. He'd escaped using the Underground Railroad, traveling at night, hiding during the day, until he'd crossed into the North. He was 45 years old. His hands were scarred. His back bore whip marks. His left hand was missing 2 fingers. But he was free. He never practiced carpentry again. Couldn't bear to touch the tools. They reminded him of what he'd built, both the mansion and its collapse. Instead, he became a teacher, opened a small school for freed black children, taught them mathematics, reading, history. He never married again, never had more children. The family he'd lost couldn't be replaced. But sometimes, late at night, he would sit alone and think about September 12th, 1856. He would think about the 3 seconds it took for justice to fall. He would think about 11 men who treated human beings as property, who'd separated families without hesitation, who built fortunes on suffering. And he would think about 163 holes drilled over 6 months, 48 wedges carved with precision, 8 beams engineered for catastrophic failure. He never told anyone what he'd done. The secret stayed locked inside him, like those wedges had been locked inside the beams. When Samuel died in 1889, at age 76, his obituary mentioned his work as an educator and his contribution to Philadelphia's freed black community. It didn't mention South Carolina. It didn't mention the Whitmore Mansion. It didn't mention the 11 plantation owners. But at his funeral, an old woman approached his grave after everyone else had left. She was gray-haired, thin, with scars on her wrists from old shackles. Ruth. She'd escaped north during the war and had been searching for Samuel for years. She placed a small wooden wedge on his grave, one of the 48, which she'd found in the parlor rubble and kept all these years. "Rest well, old friend," she whispered. "You built something that mattered, something that fell exactly as you planned. Then she walked away, leaving the wedge behind. The groundskeeper found it the next morning and threw it away, not knowing what it was. Just a piece of scrap oak, worn smooth with age. But Ruth knew. Samuel knew. And somewhere in the invisible network of freed slaves and their descendants, the story lived on, whispered, passed down, modified and mythologized until the details blurred but the essence remained. There was a carpenter who knew how to build, and he knew how to destroy. And when they took everything from him, he used that knowledge to engineer 3 seconds of perfect justice. 163 holes, 48 wedges, 6 months of patience, 3 seconds of fall, 11 men dead, 0 suspicion. Perfect. The end.